People of progressive opinion the world over, I think, do have to stand up for those values of tolerance and respect for diversity and difference. And there is more of an obligation on us now, no matter how difficult and no matter sometimes how controversial or unpopular it may be, to be beacons of hope for these values that we all hold so dear.
I think we are touching a nerve with the American people who understand that establishment politics is just not good enough. We need bold changes. We need a political revolution.
Please clap.
Hello everyone, my name is John, and welcome to the first episode of Commoners Podcast. We are a transatlantic Politics Plus podcast bringing you commentary and criticism of the news and politics across the globe. The inspiration for Commoners came shortly after Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. My best friend Adam and I were talking about what the long-term effect of 2016 would be on liberal and progressive politics around the world. We both felt pretty helpless. We were wondering what we could do as individuals to champion and spread liberal values and, persuade other people of our point of view. We realized that the left had done a really bad job of trying to put across an argument and actually even tried to convince people of their position. And we realized that really did play a role in what we saw happen in 2016. This podcast is our attempt to reopen the dialogue between the left and the right and to help fellow liberals and progressive identify a path forward in the new political environment that we have. We thought that we would introduce ourselves. Adam, how are you?
Hi, John. I'm doing well. And hello, everyone. Welcome to Commoners. My name is Adam, and I'm the European and Christian half of this transatlantic dynamic duo. I'm recording this in Scotland, where I live with my lovely wife and son. Now, we think it's important that you know a little bit about the people that you're listening to. So here's a little bit about me if you're going to continue listening to this podcast. I was born in a Christian family and raised in the outskirts of Glasgow in the industry suburbs. We were part of a fairly fundamentalist church, meaning that we interpreted the Bible as literalists. We interpreted the Bible literally, which came with all sort of different beliefs about science and the world. And they also believed largely that Christians should have no interest or part to play in worldly power or politics. And so my parents, therefore, were largely apolitical, and political problems or ideologies were never really a part of my upbringing. In fact, it wasn't until I moved to the United States that I began to become politically aware, simply because of the sheer saturation of political thought in the day-to-day experience of American life. My social circles, both at church and at school, were conservative. They were specifically Republicans, and so I adopted the ideologies of my friends and mentors. And eventually making it to a small private Christian college where I met a rather conservative, like-minded John. My political views began to shift left simply as I began to learn and read more about the sheer volumes of thought that had been argued about over the last few millennia, and kind of as the capstone of my education and as a capstone of my political development, I spent a semester living and studying in Iceland. Now, most of you will know that, or know about Iceland for its natural beauty, the Northern Lights, which has skyrocketed to one of the top places to see before you die. But as politics gave me a much more eye-opening view, simply because it was another political system, and in this case it was a Nordic democratic socialist system. It completely shifted my views out to the progressive left, despite the many problems and imperfections that Iceland's political system had then and still suffers with today, especially after their crash in 2008. But today I still believe in democratic socialism. I still think it's the best model for a successful society, or at least for the most successful society that we can have. I'm also a great lover of science. I have degrees in linguistics and psychology, and I'm profoundly interested in the relationship between religion and science as well. I tend to favour post-modern thinking, which combined with Christianity can lead to some interesting views and perspectives. And so I won't hold to a lot of the same basic beliefs about the world as many other Christians have. But I do take seriously the need to maintain an orthodox, that's a small o orthodox theology, specifically about who God is, who Christ is, the crucifixion and resurrection, which I'm sure will lead to a lot of great discussions with you, John. You and I seem to agree on many things, but there's just so much that we have profound disagreements on, right?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably about 50-50, the things that we agree on and disagree on. As mentioned before, my name is John. Like Adam, I was raised in a very conservative Christian home. We were also biblical literalists, which applied to science. I believed in a literal 6-day young Earth creation. I thought the Earth was 6,000 years old and that Noah's Ark actually happened. When I say conservative, politically, my family thought that Bill O'Reilly was far too liberal to be reliable. So you can kind of get a sense of how extreme their views were. I was homeschooled through high school and as a result remained a conservative Christian until I went to college. I attended the same small private Christian college that Adam did. We met in a freshman core class where we were both like-minded conservative little Republicans. My dream was to eventually become a lawyer and work for the ACLJ, the American Center for Law and Justice, and I wanted to defend religious liberty in the United States, and that included teaching intelligent design in public schools. I didn't start really questioning my upbringing until the beginning of my junior year when I took a required core science class, ironically, obviously, and we reached the section on evolution. Because it was a Christian college, there was some controversy about the professors being openly evolutionists. So he didn't really take an official position, but he presented the evidence, and even with just that exposure, I was blown away. Honestly, I had never realized that the evidence was so overwhelming and convincing, mostly because I had never actually read the evidence for evolution from an evolutionist. It had been filtered through people like Ken Ham and the ICR and Answers in Genesis. So I never really had an honest presentation of the evidence. I had never realized that a Christian could be an evolutionist like this professor was. He was a very devout Christian, but he was also accepting of evolution. I had always been taught that you could not be saved and believe in evolution. That's how central it was to my theology and, my religion. This experience in this class, it really shook me. Because at the time, I remember I was reading Meditations on First Philosophy by Descartes, and I was being heavily influenced by his form of deconstructionism, particularly the Cartesian method of doubt. And so I went through this period where I systematically deconstructed all of my dogmatic beliefs that I had always held, starting with science, obviously, then with politics, and finally religion. So over the next several years, I began building my own belief systems independent from the influences of my childhood. And ultimately that led me to where I am now, a science-loving, progressively liberal agnostic atheist. As far as my personal life, what can I say? I'm the lone liberal in the family that voted almost entirely for Trump, so that makes for very interesting get-togethers. I live with my wife of 6 years, together with our 2 daughters in Massachusetts. Hockey, of course, is my sport, and Scotch is my drink.
And what a choice of drink it is. We're introducing ourselves to give you an idea about why we believe what we believe. Like everyone, our views are shaped by our experiences and built on a real desire to improve both our lives and the lives of the people that we care about, our communities. And so, how are we going to do this? As John said earlier, we're here to explore the reasons for the decline in liberal and progressive politics in the United States and in Europe, and what it has to do in the coming years to undo the damage inflicted on itself by its own missteps and by the rise of other ideologies, particularly right-wing populism. Every 2 weeks we're planning on releasing an episode in which we'll cover some of the most recent news from around the world, followed by discussion. Each episode, John and I will take a topic and research and discuss this particular topic in light of the relevant news and the relevant plight of the left. One week it might be healthcare, the next it might be nationalism, perhaps the next week it might be a recent Supreme Court case ruling. Some weeks John and I will agree on a particular solution and work together from our different perspectives to come to one single answer. And other weeks where John and I disagree, we'll have a debate and we'll put our 2 viewpoints together. Given that we have 2 different theological viewpoints and 2 different geographical viewpoints, that should create some tension, some good educational opportunities, and hopefully we'll arrive either at the same conclusion or at least understand each other's perspective a little better. And in some weeks we might even have a guest join us and help us through a particular issue. And so John, given that this is our 0th podcast or our introductory podcast, what is our introductory topic?
Well, as the first episode of this podcast, before we begin exploring the way forward, we thought that it would make sense to review what we think are the failings of the left and how these failings were one of the catalysts for the groundswell of conservative populism around the world. This idea, oddly enough, was inspired by the GOP back in March 2013. After the Republicans had been soundly defeated in 2012 across the country, the RNC published a 100-page post-mortem of sorts, and they called it the Growth and Opportunity Project. The writers of the report, they spoke with more than 2,600 people around the country from all walks of life who identified as Republicans, and even with people who had left the Republican Party. They had an online survey with over 36,000 respondents where they were trying to identify the priorities that the GOP should focus on. It was really actually pretty impressive. If you'd like to check it out yourself, a link is in the description of this episode. The report focused on how the GOP had lost touch with its constituents, and even as the nation as a whole, and identified areas that the party had to improve on if they were going to remain relevant in United States politics. Many of the findings were surprisingly self-aware, especially for the GOP. The disconnection with minorities, gays, and average Americans even were all addressed. And one of the more important points and interesting points that was made was that the GOP had become insular to a fault. They wrote, quote, "The Republican Party needs to stop talking to itself. We have become expert in how to provide ideological reinforcement to like-minded people, but devastatingly we have lost the ability to be persuasive with or welcoming to those who do not agree with us on every issue." This sort of admission, I thought, is really rare in American politics, and I think that the left could even learn a thing or two by being more aware of their own bubble. For instance, something that's really been frustrating me to no end is that the left doesn't even seem close to coming up with its own post-mortem. In fact, it seems like it's the exact opposite. You know, all we're really seeing from the left right now is deflection and finger-pointing. The establishment in particular is not really taking a hard look at itself at all, and even trying to admit where they went wrong. I mean, really, we are sanctioning Russia right now for hacking that may or may not have happened. And, 50% of Democrats, according to a recent YouGov poll, 50% of Democrats believe that Russia, quote, literally, quote, tampered with vote tallies to help Donald Trump. And, the Republicans are supposed to be the party of conspiracy theories, but here we have almost half of Democrats believing that the end result of the election was literally changed by the Russians. Which we know there's nothing even close to that. Hear me now, quote me later. Russians interfering with the 2016 election will become the Democrats' Benghazi. It's pathetic. So we thought that as a first episode, we would do what the left seems incapable or unwilling to do and give our own post-mortem of liberal politics for 2016. So here it is, the official Commoners podcast, Post-Mortem of the Left. And since Brexit happened before Trump, I figured we'd let Adam go first.
It certainly did. Although arguably the Trump campaign, in fact the whole presidential campaign, I think this is right, the Trump campaign or the presidential campaign lasted much longer than Brexit was even a possibility.
Yeah, the political campaign system in the United States is probably one of the worst in the entire world. It drags on for like 18 months.
Oh, close to 2 years almost, I think.
Oh, yeah. Especially when the incumbent president has been in for two terms. So then both parties have to run primaries. It's torture. It really is. I would much prefer a system like you have in the UK with 1 month campaigning and then the vote. Much more prefer that.
Yeah, it's supposed to help. I'm not entirely convinced it completely helps. So, as for the post-mortem, we'll start in Europe. I think a good question to start with actually is, well, what is Europe? It's really easy to think of Europe as this kind of homogenous political ideology. When particularly Americans think of Europe, they think of progressive liberal thought. They think abortion, homosexual rights, equality rights, even euthanasia rights, and assisted suicide rights as well. All of these are enshrined in law in certain parts of Europe, though not all, and that's kind of my point. Europe is many nations, it's many cultures, it's many different types of political systems. There's monarchies and republics and parliamentary systems.
Yeah, well, for instance, I was just thinking, gay marriage, even in Scotland, which is a pretty progressive place, that only happened a couple of years ago, right?
Oh, that's right, yeah. In fact, Scotland was the last place Northern Ireland has still to legalise it. It's still illegal in Northern Ireland. Civil unions, I believe, are legal in Northern Ireland, but England and Wales legalised gay marriage a couple of years ago, and Scotland came a few months after that. So it was only a recent event, particularly in Scotland. But, Finns are different from Italians, are different from Germans. Like it's different cultures, different languages, different experiences of history as well. And so each of them kind of have their own political and cultural identity. And it's not just the EU either, though admittedly the EU is kind of the foundational institution that protects progressive rights. Countries that aren't part of the EU, Switzerland and Norway, are progressive liberal countries, but there are others like Belarus and Serbia and Albania that aren't quite as progressive or as liberal, even though they're European countries. So Europe is a dynamic place and has many different perspectives and views in it. And like I said, there are actually progressive holdouts. The news that, even Europe is turning to the right with the rise of the Front National in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, even the Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, in Germany. There's still progressive holdouts that are truly still progressive. So Scotland has a progressive government. The Nordic countries, even the Conservatives, are largely progressive, especially regarding liberal rights and liberal protections. But annoyingly, within the EU, it's countries that have global power that seem to be shifting towards the right. So France and Germany, they tend to be shifting out towards the right. Now, part of the problem is that if you are in power globally, then you have, even though you have influence globally, you are also receiving global influence. And on this front, Europe tends to struggle because Europe is on the front lines of the most recent tragedy that has come up in our world, and that is Syria. The Syrian refugees have come in by their millions into Europe, and it's Europe that's on the front line dealing with the issue. The US has hardly taken any Syrian refugees.
Yeah, that's right. I think we've taken less than like 50,000. We take almost none.
It's next to nothing, whereas Germany has taken in a million, and that's just Germany itself. And so the refugee influx is a legitimate issue, and people on the ground in Europe feel the pain of the refugee crisis affecting them, whether that is financially or in population or whatever. One of the problems of Germany taking in 1 million refugees is that it's also taking in 1 million refugees into the Schengen area. And the Schengen area is an agreement between most of the European countries that mean that citizens and residents and tourists within that country can travel to other countries within the agreement without having to show identification or a passport, literally an open border. And so with the problems linked to refugees, particularly Islam and the fear about them possibly being linked to Islamic terrorism, it means that the regular Joe, the folks on the ground in Europe, the voters, wherever they are in Europe, have to struggle or have this perceived threat on their doorstep. And they're not wrong. Like, terrorism has happened.
Right. Well, I was just going to say that, it's much easier for news organizations and governments to sell, or opposition to governments and conservative wings that are trying to take power. It's much easier for them to sell fear when you have these attacks happening in Europe and them being perpetrated by refugees, unfortunately, and you have these terrorists actually hiding out in areas in Europe that are mostly populated by refugees in these very insular communities that they're finding a home for their ideology. So it's not an unfounded fear, right?
It's not. Although I would debate whether the terrorist attacks have been planned and perpetrated by refugees. If I remember right, the Brussels attack was done by Frenchmen or even a Belgian himself. So 35 dead in Brussels, 87 dead in Nice, 12 dead in Berlin, and that's just 2016. So it's not a completely non-issue.
I think the problem, though, with the left in particular is that they try to downplay to a fault the relation between Islam and terrorism. So when you have a million immigrants coming in who happen to, by and large, be Muslim, there is that factor of fear there that, well, Islam is in a lot of cases motivating these attacks. We're bringing in people who adhere to this ideology. Then there's, people are terrible at assessing risk. So even though it wouldn't necessarily be that, all of these immigrants and all of these refugees are going to turn out to be terrorists, their idea is that, well, I'm not going to eat a bowl of Skittles if one Skittle is poison, right? So it's a lot easier to sell that narrative, and it's easy to attack liberals because, by and large, liberals are pretty pro-refugee, and to be principled on that fact is very difficult when you're having such effective argumentation from the conservatives, whether or not they're right. Their narratives are speaking to people.
So you're thinking then that the major problem with the left in Europe as well as in the States is a narrative issue. I think we're largely agreed.
Oh yeah, I think the narrative issue, the narrative building and controlling the narratives is the left has been horrible at it, and I think that's sort of been one of the foundational issues with this shift towards conservative politics around the world.
Well, actually, speaking of that, Europe has experienced that very shift as well. In fact, did you know that even as of just now, before the elections that are going to be coming up this year, that most of the European countries, I believe, are run by right or centre-right governments?
That's scary.
So, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, they're already run by centre-right governments. And now, and this is actually one of the truths about Europe that is beginning to kind of be eroded away a little bit, is that even centre-right politicians, centre-right political parties will largely hold to liberal progressive values. So, for instance, France is a welfare state. They're likely to vote for a right-wing president, but it's still going to be a welfare state. United Kingdom has a conservative government, but that conservative government, while it might not be spending as much money on it, still has to maintain the NHS and is still not going to get rid of the NHS, which is still a very liberal, progressive policy, at least by American standards.
I was going to say universal healthcare, on the grand scheme of things, seems to be pretty centrist. I think we're talking about the Overton window here of the acceptable range of political ideology in the public square. In Europe, traditionally, it's been pretty, from what I can see, pretty balanced, where the center is pretty evenly split between, left and right. For instance, somebody like Bernie Sanders would be considered closer to center, a little left of center, most likely, but closer to center.
Definitely left of center, yeah.
Yeah, left of center, but in
not outright left wing.
He's in the United States,
exactly,
he's considered a complete radical.
Yeah, that's right.
And Hillary Clinton is considered a liberal. So the Overton window in the United States is right shifted to the Overton window in Europe, but it seems like you're having the same problem where it is starting to shift.
Well, that's right. Particularly as regards the far right. Now, obviously, Europe had World War II. There's still elements of far right politics and belief and ideology that's literally outlawed in Germany. But I mean, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, these were all fascist right-wing countries at one point. And so this was only about 60, 70 years ago as well. But what we're seeing is a generation later, or two generations now, is kind of the creeping in of national conservatism again.
The pendulum is starting to swing in the back.
Exactly, and that's quite difficult for people who believe in a liberal democracy. Because while these countries, in fact I'll get to a couple of them in a second, are still democracies, what they're running the risk of is losing their liberalism. And it's not liberalism as in left-wing social issues like gay marriage or abortion or what have you, kind of the big things that are heating up or hotted up in the States. It's the right for minorities to do what the majority does as well. The right of minorities to participate in the government, in the electorate.
So those things are under attack even in Europe.
Well, so for instance, I've got a quote here from the one of the MPs in the Polish Parliament from the governing Law and Justice Party. Literally, the Law and Justice Party is the name of this party. They are literally a kind of conservative rule by law party.
Yeah, I'm immediately thinking of Donald Trump. We need law and order.
Well, and this is the actual outcome of a government of that ideology in power. So I've got this quote here. The society cannot offer a sweet life to unstable, infertile relationships of people from whom the society gets no benefit, only because of their sexual bonds. Children like these, this is talking about homosexuals raising children. Children like these are not brought up correctly, cannot establish a family, commit suicides more often, and are frequently sexually abused.
I've always loved that argument, and by loved I mean it's this one of the more just dumb, for lack of a better word, arguments. For instance, my brother and sister-in-law, they cannot have children because she has a health condition, and so for people who are octogenarians who can no longer have children, for people who can't because of biological reasons, you're treating then how are they not being treated the same as homosexuals, right? Right.
And now it comes down to, for these right-wing parties, a sense of nationalism and community that is isolating other. And that is against the idea. So Poland is still a democracy. The Law and Justice Party was voted into majority into the parliament, and they'll be voted or they'll be voted upon in the next election. Like, Poland is not becoming a less democratic country necessarily, though some commentators might agree, depending on the next step the governments take regarding the constitution. But it's certainly losing its liberal side, in which majoritarianism rules, and the minority suffers.
Yeah, and you can almost sort of look at this and trace it back to actions of the United States, where we went into Iraq on bad information and we destabilized an entire region, which has given birth to ISIS. I mean, our interventions in Afghanistan gave birth to Al-Qaeda, who were the Mujahideen back then in the late 70s. But I think a truism around the world, and even in the United States, is that when people are safe physically and financially, they tend to lean more liberal, like as far as social issues, as far as equality, because people are doing okay. But when you have, at least in the United States, we have a stagnant economy because of neoliberal policies over the last 30 years, and then you have neoconservative policies that have led to sort of the problems that we have with radical Islamic terrorism right now. People don't feel safe financially or physically. And so what's going on is that, in my opinion, because people don't feel safe in these two areas, they're much more likely to gravitate towards an authoritarian leader who guarantees safety over freedom and liberal social values. So they're willing to sort of give up on those social values because they prefer safety over that.
Yeah, absolutely. The wallet comes first, social issues be damned. in that sense. By the way, the quote I just read was from Kristina Pavlovich. I should have mentioned that at the time. She said that in 2013. She's a law and justice member of the Polish Parliament. One of the other countries kind of having the same issue. So Poland is one struggling with the rise of the right wing, and Hungary is the other. Viktor Orban is a fairly well-known controversial figure now who is fairly anti-European. His party has changed the constitution so that amendments and legislation passed by his party can't be challenged in court, or at least that's the allegation. They're also a national conservative party. They've got the same type of protectionist policies that you were speaking of. People have definitely voted for him because of their security needs that just haven't been answered by the left. So Hungary is literally, or at least very close to, the border of Europe. It's down there fairly close to Turkey, Bulgaria, another EU country, which is also struggling with the influx of refugees. But people are turning towards these guys because of their lack of security. I think that was absolutely right. That is Hungary at the moment, and the Fidesz party under Viktor Orban.
So we're seeing this rise of conservative politics in Europe, right? And you can see that as a direct reaction almost to the failing of left-wing politics in Europe to adequately address people's concerns. So could you give a little bit more detail, where the left has failed in Europe and what's led to this sort of, general distaste for left-wing politics that's allowing conservatism and populism to be on the rise? Okay. So on one hand, the left is failing itself. So in France, when François Hollande came to power almost 5 years ago now, the main platform he had was a legitimate socialist platform. One of the biggest issues he had was actually implementing socialist policy. So he tried to reform union law, he tried to reform workers' rights, he tried to reform a few major, typically socialist policies, and he failed to do it, and not failed to do it as in he was stopped by some opposition. He just didn't do it. And so on one hand, you've got a failure of policy, or coming through with policy. Now, part of this was simple financial costs, financial reasons, particularly in regards to the European Union. The euro has been suffering over the past few years. But there is just a general inability of the left to function in government, it seems. The other problem is that it just completely abandons. It doesn't fail, it just abandons the main support base. So this kind of happened here in the UK back in the 1990s with Tony Blair. Tony Blair moved the Labour Party, the main left-leaning party, into the centre. And it worked. He managed to gain votes from not only the left and the centre-left, but a lot of the centre-right middle class that kind of agreed with his social policies. As he actually started, under the Blair government, taking money out of the NHS and actually shrinking parts of the welfare state as well. His policies weren't overtly socialist, they were kind of overtly centrist. It was under Labour that the economy actually did fairly well, but in doing so it was because of some rather not so liberal finance policies. Now, under Corbyn as well, when the left-leaning Labour Party has actually become left-leaning again, they struggle with the same problem that François Hollande has. They have an inability to create concrete platforms. Their voter base is split, particularly on this Brexit issue. Corbyn is an anti-nationalist in a nationalist era. And so there's all these things that these major kind of left-leaning political leaders aren't understanding or not falling into line with. I don't want the leaders necessarily to fall into line because we want them to be people of principle now. Right, but they're stuck in their bubble.
Exactly.
They don't understand how they're coming across
and then
to average people.
Correct. And they're not necessarily communicating with the needs and worries of the people, as you were saying before. It's a security first. It's an economic security. It's a physical security first type of world, and the left isn't providing these answers in Europe.
Especially in recent years. I mean, the security concern has become front and center everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was reading off those mortality rates from recent terrorist attacks in particular, but the threat of it is ongoing. You see it, oftentimes, the governments, the French government, the Belgian government has released information on terrorist attacks they've stopped, and it's, of course, represented and reported in the media all over the continent.
Right. They just keep putting their foot in their mouth.
Yes, essentially. And so, essentially, the left now in Europe has dwindled in support. You've got the Labour Party. The Fabian Group is a group here that does research into social trends. And its recent report coming out said that Labour wouldn't be able to hold on to more than a fifth of the seats in Parliament, where it's supposed to hold, or at least in the past has held, well over half. So it's such a sad state of affairs for them. And I'm no Labour supporter myself. I don't quite like their, I particularly don't like Corbyn, but I don't tend to agree with their basic fundamental beliefs, particularly. Well, we might be able to get into it in another episode, but particularly their cross-border, you have more in common with your class than you do your country. I fundamentally disagree with that. But either way, this is the state of the left. They tend to be globalists when the people are becoming nationalists. They tend to be elites. They are associated with elites. It's often the elites that... and when I say elite, I mean kind of... in fact, John, I think you and I might actually count as elites in this case. We're college-educated. Like, you work in pensions and finance. I have a couple degrees. We might actually count as the elites here.
We are true champagne socialists.
Well, Prosecco socialist, I think, on my end. But I can't afford the champagne yet.
Well enough. Scotch socialist.
The left is associated with open borders when we don't want open borders anymore, or when the people don't want open borders anymore. Its associations have led it to be distrusted by its assumed base, and its the working class and the lower middle classes. And it's resulted in Brexit. The left-leaning parties here couldn't make a good enough argument for remaining in the European Union that the working classes and lower middle classes voted to get out. Well, we'll have probably an entire separate episode on Brexit itself, but largely that is where we are in Europe just now, is that the progressive liberal thought is associated with globalism, associated with elitism, associated with open borders, and it's abandoned its base by doing so.
Yeah. One of the things I think that played a role here in the United States too was just the inability or the unwillingness of the left to put an argument across and actually try to convince people of their position, and instead sort of just demeaning people for not believing what was, self-evidently true, which is the liberal position. It's it comes back to the insularity, that bubble where the left seems incapable. I've seen that in the United States. I know that was a big factor in the United States. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But do you see the same things happening over there, where if you disagree with the left, you're a xenophobe, you're a racist, you're backward, bad almost, because you have different beliefs instead of trying to convince people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the discussion that has come out from Brexit now, is the question of how the people that voted to leave were treated during the campaign and are being treated now. And so where the left essentially pointed and shouted xenophobe, anti-immigrant, and certainly there were those, like UKIP, for instance, and further right than UKIP, they would have supported leave anyway on immigration issues. But there are plenty of people that voted to get out simply because they saw the European Union as an erosion of their liberal democracy. of their rights, of their ability to make money, essentially, and feel secure.
So there were rational arguments against it that were not addressed. It was just lumping the people who supported it into a bucket of deplorables, let's say.
You do get the same parallel arguments being made about the people who either voted for Trump or voted to leave Brexit, voted to leave the EU.
Yeah, it's tough. The left is. It's so disheartening to see the position that they're in around the world, and there seems to be so much overlap in what they've done wrong. I mean, we can get into now what I've sort of identified to be the failings of the left in the United States, but there's so much here I think that overlaps, maybe not specifics, situations, but overarching ideas here. There's a term that I really like it's epistemic closure, which is a fancy way of saying you're in a bubble. You believe that your arguments are right solely because you're surrounded by people who agree with you, and you're not challenged on what you believe, and you don't have open discussions with other people to figure out why they believe what they do. You just have this assumption of rightness, and it leads you into an echo chamber in which you are not challenged, and you have no reason to change what you believe. Conversely, personally, I think obviously that liberal values are correct, but it doesn't give you an opportunity to then convince other people, because you're closing yourself off from that discussion. And I don't know that it's necessarily the fault of the left. I think you see it in both parties, because the way that we gather information now, we live in this age where you're on Facebook, you're on social media, you're online looking for media, where it's so easy to get yourself into an echo chamber because you can just block people you don't want to listen to. And so you're not getting a fair, I think, cross-section of opinion, especially since, there are algorithms on sites like Facebook and things that will monitor what you post and monitor the things that you click on and read, and they'll suggest articles of similar titles. So, when I have suggested news articles on Facebook, since I tend to be pretty liberal, I'm getting like Newslow and Occupy Democrats, which is, just as bad propaganda of leftism as Fox News and Breitbart is of conservative values. So you're sort of automatically channeled into this echo chamber by just how we're consuming news, and you have to make a conscious effort to actually be exposed to dissenting and opinions to your own. And YouTube comments and Facebook comments are not the place to go for that. You just you're not necessarily exposed to the type of information that you should be exposed to. Do you have the same experience? I mean, I know that I have that experience.
It is one that I've had to actively overcome myself. I kind of make it a point to follow as many different viewpoints as I can on Twitter, for instance. I certainly do actually have many friends from particularly high school days and earlier that are still fairly conservative. So, but to be honest, it has been a concerted effort to do that.
And, the left has sort of assumed that they've won the culture war. I don't know. I know that you saw that video by the guy, Jonathan Pye, that English guy who it does the fake news reports, and he did his response to Trump, and one of the things that he said was, the left has won the culture war, so if you disagree with us, you're bad, you're stupid, you're sexist, you're homophobic, you're xenophobic. When a lot of people's concerns, they feel they're legitimate, they have reasons for what they think. And most people are not going to walk around saying, I'm such a racist, I'm such a xenophobe, I'm such a homophobe. They don't really think that about themselves, and they're being assigned these labels, at least in the United States, that are hurled at them mostly by liberals, and it just they associate liberals now with intolerance. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from my family, tolerant quotes, tolerant liberals, again, not tolerating my viewpoint. And it is sad. It is sad.
We don't necessarily need to get into this just now, but I actually somewhat agree with them in that. Well, I guess that is the point of this podcast, isn't it? Is that we are fighting also against ourselves in a sense that there is a segment of the left that is legitimately opposed to liberal values. So there's almost a situation in which the progressive and liberal left is losing its progressivism and has already lost its liberalism. Liberal being the ability to voice and live as you wish as an individual freely within your society.
Exactly. And the problem, though, with that is that they're using the label of a liberal. And so people associate liberals with that philosophy, even though liberalism is not that at all. And so when you try to convince people of liberal positions, actually true liberal positions, they are more apt not to listen to you just because of the fact that you're liberal. And that should never be the case. It should never be the case just because somebody is X that you won't listen to them. I run into that all the time because I'm not a Christian and I don't believe in God. And if I have a conversation with somebody and I could have an in-depth conversation with them, and then if they find that out, then, I'm not going to listen to anything that you said. I'm just going to disregard what you said because of what you are and what you believe. So you had this bubble of the left where they couldn't see what was going on, especially the establishment left. They couldn't understand that the majority of Americans were hurting, and they both financially, and they did not feel secure with the things that are going around the world. And so it was just what was Hillary always saying? Rather than make America great again, it was America is already great, which it didn't feel like that to most people. And this bubble led almost directly, I think, to their failure in messaging and narratives. Because if you don't understand what your constituents and what your base and what the American people as a whole are feeling, if you don't think that their concerns are legitimate, then your messaging is going to be completely off. Like I just mentioned, she would say, America's already great in response to Donald Trump, when the overwhelming majority of people did not feel that way. They would say things like, I'm with her. Oh my God. Talk about serving up a meatball for Donald Trump to get up there at a rally
and he did.
And just say that he did. And he was brilliant to do so. His campaign managers nailed that. You're making it so easy for him. He gets up there and she says, I'm with her. How narcissistic. When he is to have Donald Trump up there legitimately accusing you of narcissism, that's like a whole nother level of failure, you know?
Yeah, no, there was a few instances, in fact, here, talk about branding issues. If your brand is so bad that while running a race against candidate Trump, you're the one that's known as telling untruths, you have a branding problem. If you're running against Trump and you're the one that's known as the liar, that is a spectacular failure in your branding, in your messaging, and in your ability to actually connect with people's issues.
Yes. And also, it's a reflection on the candidate that you chose. And we'll get to that in a minute. But when you fail to understand what people are feeling, when you fail in your messaging and your campaign slogans and your strategy, your campaign strategy, you can't develop a direction. There was no discernible direction in Hillary. Basically, it was the status quo. She was telling us that America was already great. She was the symbol, the ultimate symbol of the establishment in this election, when people wanted something outside of the establishment. People have been wanting it for a long time, and you could see the build up to this. You could almost, it's not hard to predict that somebody outside of the establishment would have won.
And along that line as well, obviously they failed to see that people wanted change, but I didn't think they recognized how badly people wanted change either. So much so that they would vote for someone like Trump to bring along that change.
Oh, absolutely. And you had people who voted for Obama twice in a row who voted for Trump in places like in towns in Wisconsin, which Hillary didn't even bother campaigning in after the primary because she assumed it was the Democratic firewall and she would win.
Yeah, far too much of an assumption, but
unbelievable. And so she offered no palpable change. She didn't offer a discernible direction. Stronger together. I'm with her. America's already great. Just vacuous nonsense. And she literally gave up every opportunity to talk about policy substance. If she had actually talked about policy substance and shown how she was better than Donald Trump, maybe she would have won, but it wasn't. There were no policy discussions. It really wasn't. It was fighting this PC outrage campaign against Donald Trump because he's such this terrible person who says these terrible things. And don't vote for him because he's a racist, he's a xenophobe. If you support him, 50% of you are xenophobes and racists and deplorables. I can't think of a more ineffective way of reaching somebody that you disagree with to support you and agree with you than how she approached it.
Literally going back to playground rules and calling them names.
It's true. And honestly, if I were to sit down to write a fiction about the 2016 presidential election, I honestly don't think, in my capacity as an author, with my creative abilities, I don't think I would be able to write a character who was more inept and just, blasé, offered no change. You could not write a worse candidate. You couldn't even create one worse than Hillary Clinton. I honestly don't think so. Other than Trump. But I mean, how is it that you are beat by that? To lose to Donald Trump, how much of a failure is that?
But who does the left run instead? Like, if it's not going to be your biggest heavy hitter from the Democratic Party, then who are you going to run?
Well, you know my answer to that. Bernie Sanders, obviously. Now, okay, so maybe Bernie would not have won, but I'm convinced he would not have lost Wisconsin. He beat Hillary in Wisconsin.
I am not entirely... Well, I'm one of the people that are not convinced that Bernie would have won either, particularly because he's a little bit too left-wing for that Overton window that you were talking about. The right-wing bias in the American Overton window kind of puts Bernie Sanders out in the left-leading edge.
That's true, yeah. I mean, talking about himself, and he was clear to define himself as a democratic socialist.
Which you can't do in America, though. You can't use the word socialist in America.
That's true. I will give you that. And so, the sad fact of the matter is that neoliberals have created a position of the left in the United States. I mean, you had Bill Clinton come into office, and he branded himself as this new Democrat, this more centrist Democrat who agreed more with the Republicans on a lot of things than Democrats had in the past. He was not a New Deal Democrat. He was not a FDR. He was this more reasonable, triangulating president. Okay, and the left, the Democrats in the United States have taken on that model and just owned it and said, this is how we're going to run from now on, except for with the exception of Obama. And you saw Obama beat Hillary Clinton pretty in the end pretty handily, and it was because he was campaigning further to the left and the base wanted that. Ultimately he governed as a centrist, so I think that he sort of went from I put in my notes, he went from hope to nope, because really he just did not implement really the progressive liberal things that he campaigned on that people loved him for campaigning on. He governed as a centrist, and he didn't have the courage of his convictions to do progressive liberal things that he could have, to really solidify the left and say, this is what liberalism stands for in the United States. This is what liberalism is. It's not Hillary Clinton. It's not Bill Clinton. It's not Tim Kaine. It's not Joe Biden. This is what progressive politics is. And I think he missed an excellent opportunity. And so you had Hillary Clinton being identified as left, in the United States, which made Bernie look like insane. And even so, he won 22 states and 47% of the vote in the Democratic primary. And even then, many of his supporters, not myself, many of his supporters ended up voting for Trump because they wanted a change. They wanted a change, and Hillary Clinton was not that change. In fact, she was the worst candidate that the DNC could have put forward, given that there was no awareness of the political environment in which the 2016 election happened. And
I kind of will add on that point, to add to your argument a little bit, is that even in the UK, where folks like Tony Blair were moving kind of the left-leaning party back towards the centre, it was a far more kind of economically conservative fiscal policy, economic policy than Labour governments beforehand. You would still never find Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband giving multi-$1,000 speeches to large corporate banks. You just would never ever see that happening. The leader of the People's Party cannot be giving $1,000 speeches to corporate banks.
And that's the problem, is the Democrats are no longer the People's Party. They're no longer the party of workers. I mean, they used to be a legitimate workers' party with the New Deal and FDR, but they're just not that anymore. Basically the only thing that they're better on is social issues. Really, they're just as hawkish. They're just as interventionist. Obama is currently involved in 7 interventions. 7 interventions. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he dropped over 12,000 bombs last year. Like, it's neoconservatism. It's not liberalism. And so
there's no People's Party in the United States.
No, really, there's not. Maybe the Democrats will throw you a bone every once in a while, but it's far too corporatist in the United States, and there really is not a legitimate People's Party. And so when you have a party that refuses to really talk honestly about the threats that we face around the world, when you have a party that focuses more on identity politics than on policy issues, and that is only better than the Republicans in social issues, and does not have a substantially better fiscal policy, it's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid. Just like James Carville said back in the Clinton administration, if people's wallets are fat and they are financially secure, they will tend to agree with you on social issues. But social issues take a back seat when you can't adequately put food on the table for your kids. It just does not.
Security is the primary thing again.
Yes, and so you don't have a legitimate People's Party. Everything is so far shifted to the right, and Hillary was such a disliked character that it was the perfect storm for Trump to win. And I personally was not surprised that Trump won. I thought that there was a very good chance. I mean, it was absolutely embarrassing for Huffington Post to have Hillary Clinton at 98% or whatever they had her at to win the election the day of the election. I mean, that is the definition of being in a bubble.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will give a shout out. They get a lot of flack for it, but a shout out to Nate Silver in 538, who predicted a 33%, 35% that Trump would win, which was higher than any of the other predictive models. They'd still get a lot of flack for not being able to call the election. I know that, for instance, you're not even too big a fan of Silver, but I think they get a little bit too much flack for, almost how right they were, which is quite funny.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem with those statistical models, too, is that they don't take into account intangible things like Hillary not campaigning in the states that she needed to win.
But it is taking into account things like polling that is being taken in those states. Actually, probably a good topic for an episode is polling and the accuracy of polling in recent years.
Right. Well, and also we were talked about earlier that, people were talked about as deplorables or terrible people because they wanted to vote for Trump. There was a legitimate issue with polling data in this election cycle where people were not saying that they were going to vote for Trump because they didn't want to be on the record saying that they were voting for Trump, even though they were. And so there were some polls that were off due to that. But yeah, the strategy, the relying on identity politics, she would be the first woman president. That's not a negative, but it felt like that was her fallback, first of all. And it also felt like her only argument that she really put across for voting Hillary Clinton was, well, what are you going to do? Vote for Trump? Look at what a dumpster fire that guy is. And it turns out that when you talk to the American people like that, when you insult their intelligence to that level, yeah, they're going to vote for Donald Trump. The fact that they did not see this coming and that they were so shocked by it just shows you how out of touch they were. And unfortunately, I think you can lay a lot of this at the feet of the outgoing administration, Obama. And as good as he has been on a lot of things, social issues definitely, his work with, moratoriums on drilling and pipelines and on climate change, his raising wages effectively for workers because he expanded overtime rules, things like that. Not Obamacare. We are agreed that Obamacare is a incredibly flawed piece of legislation.
Absolutely agreed. It is terrible.
And that also lend itself to the vilification of the left, because that was talked about and framed by the Republicans as socialized medicine. And so the idea was that Obamacare was a liberal position, which it was not at all. And so Paul Ryan actually recently said that Obama is, and this gets into narratives, and I want to touch that quickly before we finish, but it talked about, he said that Obama is a prime example to the failure of liberalism in American politics. I don't know the exact quote because I'm pulling it off the top of my head, but he literally said that, and that is the most incorrect thing I've ever heard, because Obama's policies have not been all that liberal. They've been centrist at best with a little bit of progressivism sprinkled in. And so you've seen this over the last 8 years, and even before then, where the right is excellent at narrative building, the left sucks at it. Something that I can think of is when I think it was Sandy Hook that happened. They tried to put through mediocre background checks, just universal background checks, nothing like gun control, just background checks, which were very popular. 90% of the American people wanted them. Even the majority of NRA members wanted universal background checks, but the Republicans did not vote for it. There was a sit-in for gun control. I don't think it happened after Sandy Hook. I think it was after the Miami shooting, where literally the Democrats sat in there and they actually were showing some guts, some chutzpah, some actual conviction, and showing the courage of their convictions. And the Republicans got super uncomfortable about it. I mean, Mitch McConnell was out there, flabbergasted, like trying to gain control of the narrative. The Republicans, I found, have not been great at defending themselves. They're great at the preemptive narrative, and the Democrats just go along with it. If the Democrats, I think, honestly, if they were to grow some, I was going to say grow some balls, but that's, if they were to be more courageous, they could put the Republicans back on their toes, and they never do that. For instance, something that just came out the other day through my research, I didn't even realize this. When you're talking about one of the big things, the social conservative issues, is abortion in the United States. And one of the big things is defunding Planned Parenthood. So the left all they're saying is, they provide so many essential services for free to American women, and it's a bastion of women's rights to have Planned Parenthood, and that's all correct. But they don't talk numbers, and they don't craft the narrative in the way that the Republicans do. The Republicans talk about federal funding going to abortions, and while we know that that's actually a very small percentage of the services offered by Planned Parenthood, we know overwhelmingly it's mostly cancer screenings, birth control, STD tests, things like that are excellent and needed, and actually help lower rates of teen pregnancy and lower rates of miscarriages and things like that. Women are healthier now reproductively than they have been almost ever in the United States' history, and certainly we're at an all-time low over 30 years of, I think it was teen pregnancy or something like that. But instead of talking about it in those terms, they allow the Republicans just to say, oh, well, our federal funding is going towards abortions. There is something called the Hyde Amendment, which forbids federal funding to be used for abortions. So abortive services at Planned Parenthood, for the most part, are paid for through out of the pocket or of the person's insurance. There are some exceptions to that rule for Medicaid funding, but even then, those exceptions, by and large, I think actually only, are for medically necessary abortions or for abortions that threaten the life of the mother. So if the life of the mother is in jeopardy, that's when Medicaid funding can be used. So there's no attempt to even put forward those facts. There's no attempt to actually talk about the issue at hand and bring up the facts and say, well, the Republicans are lying about this, and they don't bother crafting the narratives. They just, I don't even know what they do. It's pathetic, and it has been for so long, and it has been throughout Obama's years, that the left is just viewed as, rightly, I think, in my opinion, the Democrats in the United States are viewed as these spineless people who, just are these crazy, wackadoo, socially liberal people who want these insane things, when really what they want by and large, or at least the progressive liberals, what they want by and large, is the betterment of the condition of the American people. So there it is, such as it is, our post-mortem of the left. We hope that you've enjoyed it. That's it for this episode. Thank you for joining us. And don't forget, actually, we're going to have a special episode sort of next Monday. It's not going to be every 2 weeks for the first few episodes. Next Monday, we will be discussing Donald Trump's inauguration and first day in office. That should be fun.
Also, here in the UK, we're awaiting the outcome of a major ruling on Brexit. The Supreme Court is ruling on whether the Parliament must have a say in triggering Article 50, and more important, the role of the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We'll bring you some news from there as well. Also, the week after, we'll have a special live stream show. This will just be a little informal conversation between ourselves, between John and myself, as we take the Political Compass test together. You can find the test itself at politicalcompass.org, and then you can listen to us kind of discuss our own answers to it, some of which we'll agree on, some of which we'll disagree on.
If you like this episode, you can follow us on Twitter at CommonersPod for daily news and updates on upcoming episodes. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube for any live streams or YouTube exclusive content. The music for today's episode is Not For Nothing by Otis McDonald. Be sure to check out the description for a link to the rest of Otis's work. Until next time, stay informed.